Hi, welcome. Thank you for attending this webinar. So today we're going to talk about how to expand the view of the science of reading beyond phonics. And this is specific to Utah. So thanks for being here. I hope you are doing well. So before we go any further, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Margaret Opatz. I am a former Utah educator, and now I currently work for a company called CAPTI, and they have, we have reading assessments that have been brought to the market from ETS, specifically for reading. But I've really wanted to create a Utah community because I think the landscape in Utah looks different than other states. So I used to work at the University of Utah's Reading Clinic while I was getting my dissertation. So I'm very familiar with that. And that's actually why, that's one of the reasons why I feel pretty inclined to start working more with how do we actually use the science of reading beyond phonics, because I think there's so much information on how to do that in the early grades. But when I was doing intervention at middle schools, I feel like there was kind of a dearth of knowledge because of just the way that kind of all the funds are put together. I'm working with an ed tech startup, and it's called CAPTI. And through CAPTI, the ETS developed reading assessments are being brought to market. So I just want to mention that. So here's what I'd like to go over today. I'd like to just kind of paint a picture of the current reality, discuss the science of reading, and then go into how we can actually move beyond phonics. So I don't know if you're familiar with this podcast, but Sold a Story came out, and it seems like everyone, whether or not they were in education or not, was talking about this for a while. The second that anyone would find out that I was in the reading and literacy field, this kept coming up. So I'm probably telling you stuff that you already know, but I think it's just so crazy how much the science of reading is just everywhere. So we have it across the nation. Legislation is coming into place. There's this clear need. Utah has joined that movement. There's $20 million put into the education system within Utah to get students reading. And then I found this interesting too, that within Utah now there are this panel of experts that are serving on all of the hiring committees at the university level. And they have this clear lens of what the science of reading is. And they're really trying to help teacher prep programs ensure that they're training people and hiring people who really have a solid foundation of knowledge within the science of reading. And then I think we have all of this money coming in, and then we see that we've had this historic slide, which isn't surprising given COVID and that what's termed as the COVID slide. But I think it also kind of illustrates that we have to do something different in the way that we've been teaching. So with all of that being said, it seems like the number one thing that's being focused on is phonics. So I'm not sure if that's just because it's kind of an easy concept for people outside of education to kind of cling on to. But it seems like that's where all of our money is being put. And even in the state of Utah, we see letters being taught to K3, but then kind of beyond that, we're not really seeing a lot beyond that for how we teach older students through the science of reading. So it kind of started to make me think, is the science of reading synonymous with phonics? Are we saying it's the same thing? Because if you look at all of the popular media, it seems like it would be. But as educators, I think it's important for us to just recognize that the science of reading actually comes from this vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research. And specifically, this is coming from areas of research that are in cognitive psychology, special education, linguistics, neuroscience, and it's from 5 decades of research across the world. And it's not just in English, we have multiple languages that have really looked at what really informs the science of reading. So this is a body of research that informs how reading and writing develop, and then why some students have difficulty. It is expected that students will have difficulty. And then it really is meant to guide how we can most effectively assess and teach reading and writing. So when we talk about the science of reading, that's really the framework to guide us. And one of the concepts I think that's really big within the science of reading is Scarborough's reading rope. And I think this is a good illustration because it shows us all of these intricacies that go into skilled reading. And that's what I want to take a look at first. So when you look at the word recognition strands, that's where phonics is coming. And these, I think we've done a really great job of being able to say, like, what does this entail? So we know that there's phonological awareness, we know there's decoding, and then we also know that there's sight recognition. And I'm not trying to downplay that these aren't important. I know that these are important, especially given the phoneme-grapheme correspondence and knowing that English doesn't have that one-to-one correspondence. And this is illustrated through having 26 letters and 44 phonemes. We know that that's going to cause some issues for students, and they have to be explicitly taught. And within those 44 phonemes, we know that there's 20 vowel sounds and 24 consonant sounds with over 175 spelling patterns. So I mentioned that because I want to recognize that it is important, but it's not all that we have to look at. So we have this completely separate strand that is called the language comprehension strands. And that's what I'm really going to focus on throughout today's webinar. So within the language comprehension strands, we have background knowledge. And this really just includes any knowledge that someone has on that given topic. We have vocabulary, and that's just the amount of words that a student might know. We have the language structures. So this would include syntax, how sentences come together, and then semantics, how the sentences come together and create meaning. We also have verbal reasoning, being able to infer meaning from the text, but also recognize metaphors. And then we also have literary knowledge, which are print concepts, knowing how to just navigate a text, and then also being able to do that in various genres. So let's go through a little bit more of the language comprehension strand. So specifically for language comprehension, there are a few things that students have to be able to know. So the first one is they need to know how academic language differs from conversational language. And that's just a reality. So when a student walks through the doors of school, it feels very different language from a language perspective because academic language is expected. So it's important for students to know the difference. So if I have table in a conversation and I can point to a physical object and say, let's sit at the table over there, that's very different than saying, let's examine the table on page 13. So if you have a table on page 13 that's decontextualized, you have to make sense of the data. It's a very different use of the word, and students just have to know that. The same is true of a volcano. I can say to my 3-year-old daughter, a volcano is a mountain that sometimes spews lava. That's a very simplistic explanation. But when you look at the example on the academic side, this actually came straight out of a 5th grade textbook. So just take a second and read that, and just 5th grade, yeah. So could you imagine the difference between me saying that it might just spew lava compared to having to make sense of that text? There are constructions that are used in academic language that I'll get to later, but students have to know that there is just a difference and that it's not meant to be the same thing. We're not meant to use conversational language in an academic language situation, such as school or writing. The last one would just be an explanation of deforestation. So you might just tell a student, in a conversation, people cut down trees to make money, but then on the right side, you see that if we put it into academic words, it's a lot more abstract, and just like, it seems like the meaning is kind of hidden within there. So students have to be able to know that's intended to be that way. It's set up to be that way. So moving on, if they know the difference, now they have to know how it's constructed. So when we think about academic language, it's really important to know that we compact this information to create these lexically dense sentences. And that is a really technical way of saying we just pack information into sentences. So in a conversation, you might say, my sister used to tell me about the dog she wanted. When we look at lexical density, we count the number of nouns and verbs. So in conversations, we often have about 4 per sentence. You could have less, you could have a little bit more, but it's typically around 4. In academic sentences, it's not uncommon to have 8. It's actually more common to even have more. So if you look at like high school level texts, there might be like 12 of these lexical words within there. And the reason that this creates complexity is because these carry so much meaning and information that it's a lot harder to unpack. So that's really important for students to know as well, and for teachers. It's also important to know that academic language actually employs these specific techniques and strategies that have been developed over time by these insiders. So scientists have a specific way of communicating, as do historians, and you're expected to write in that way. The same would be true for like for somebody majoring in English in college. Like you have like this like literary analysis, and you kind of like follow that type of structure, and that is intended to be that way because that's how the insiders communicate. Yeah, but I mentioned this somewhat, but in science, we are expected to present information as fact, but there's like no way that we're like telling how we know what we know. So like, even if you think about like going back to that volcano, like how do we know what happens inside? When you read like a volcanic informational text, it's never saying something like the first scientists like to go inside, like figured out how the lava is coming up, right? We don't get that information. It's just presented to us as factual. And then in history, it's presented abstractly, and we don't find out really who is responsible. So if you like read a historical account from like, let's say the American Revolution, you're going to get one account if you're reading it from the UK side compared to the US's side. So once students know how it's constructed, they also need to know that they need to be taught general academic vocabulary, disciplinary vocabulary, and morphology to really be able to succeed in understanding these language comprehension strands. So when I think about general academic vocabulary, I'm pulling from Averill Coxhead's academic word list. And these are the terms that are used across disciplines. So common words used across disciplines could be like analyze or compute. If we say analyze, that looks different for somebody who's teaching social studies or history as compared to somebody who's teaching ELA. So, oh, I just mentioned this. So that would be an example. Readers can analyze a novel, historians analyze an event, and scientists analyze the results of an experiment. So then we also have that disciplinary vocabulary, and these are typically words that teachers kind of gravitate to because they're the words that like stick out. So these are very technical terms, and they're used with specificity within the domain or the discipline. So in science, if you have like school, which means group, and school of fish, that's a very different meaning from school as in like the physical building that students are in. When using disciplinary vocabulary, the information is compacted into these nominal phrases. So one example of that would be sedimentary rocks. if you think about sedimentary rocks, those are small pieces of sediment that have been compacted over thousands of years. We don't go into the process, we just compact it into this really short phrase that compacts a bunch of meaning but doesn't explain that meaning. And then if you also think about that from the historical perspective, the Great Depression, so if you think about that, that's compacting a decade's worth of information into 3 words. It's like to unpack that is actually quite a task that students, they have to know that the authors are using these techniques to be able to talk about this time period without having to like re-explain everything. It's a means of being able to quickly refer back to this historical event. And then in morphology, so we know that morphology is the study of word parts. And students have to be able to know that morphemes are the smallest unit of speech. Actually, it's not speech, it's right, like the unit that carry meaning. And we know that words can be morphemes, but not all morphemes are words. So for instance, in remake, we have 2 morphemes, re and make. Re is a morpheme, that means again, but it's not a word. And then make is a morpheme, and that means to form, and it is a word. So when students know these word parts, then they are able to recognize the word part and then start to make sense of additional words that have those same word parts or morphemes. Okay, so then the next thing that students have to know is how relationships are constructed across the text. So there's specific features that are within academic texts that create these relationships. So the first one is logical connections. So there are specific ways to do this. And this is meant to develop this reasoning across the text. So this can be at the sentence level, but it's also at that discourse level, the text level. And it can happen with explicit markers. So in this sentence, because is the explicit marker that's showing the relationship in the cause-effect relationship. So if you had the deer population suffered because of all the snow, and I wrote this example from our winter here in Utah. The explicit marker because is a sure sign, right? That's just cause and effect. However, when you get into middle school and high school, we get away from these explicit markers, and now it's these implicit sentence constructions that create more complexity for students. So this is still a cause and effect sentence, but there's no specific marker. So with all the snow, the deer population suffered. And that's a really important thing to teach students, how to make those connections. I think in the lower grades, it's kind of common to talk about, oh, well, what kind of relationship is in this sentence? Or like you might have like cause effect, sequential. You might teach students that, but when we get to these upper grades, like from really 4th grade on, it's not as obvious. So it's important for students to know that. The next thing, oops, let me see if I can click here. Okay. The next thing is reference. So there's the complexity of being able to tell what something's referring to also increases with the text complexity or throughout grade levels. So there's these chains of reference that are accomplished using pronouns and synonyms. So I think these are pretty obvious. This first one is pretty obvious, right? Like the banker had no money left alone, and we know that he's referring back to the banker. Students are pretty good at figuring out that meaning, but then when we get into a more advanced relationship or reference, this is more challenging. So when we use this, I think this is such a challenging word because it's referring back to that previous sentence. So you have to be able to understand what was said in that sentence to be able to know, okay, this is referring back to, okay, so the white suffragists and then what they believed. And then you have to carry that previous sentence into this next sentence. So if we ask students to connect, well, what is this referring to? That's a really big task, but they have to be able to do it to actually like make sense of the text. I think this is also a very good connection to writing. Like when we're using this, like what are we really referring back to? And that would be a great writing connection. And then there's also synonyms, and synonyms also create a pretty big challenge for students because these are kind of like subtle synonyms in terms of like we're referring to the same object, but we're saying it in a different way. And I say that it's subtle because they can be kind of tricky. Like you may not even recognize that there are synonyms being used to refer back to the same object, but this is very common, especially when we get into upper elementary, middle school, and high school texts, because the author is doing it intentionally to not be saying the same repetitive phrase again and again. But it's tricky for students. They have to know what's being referred to. Okay, so that's about relationships within the sentence. Now, the next piece that students have to know is how to draw disciplinary conclusions. And what I mean by that is when you're reading a text, you have to be able to look at it through the lens of who wrote it. And this is very specific to, I would lean more towards middle school and high school, because that's where you're really getting into these disciplinary texts that are written through these different lenses. So when you are in English class, you have to assume that critical stance as a literary critic. You're looking through, trying to like figure out the meaning, connecting the information, but you're assuming this critical stance of the text, evaluating what the text says, and even sometimes the writing as well. So that's different than from what scientists do. When scientists read a text, they're trying to determine the validity of the sources and the quality of evidence. That's very different from what a literary analysis would be. And then for historians, you're looking for the bias. What is the author's stance? Where are they coming from? What do they believe? And trying to kind of like not just identify the bias, but like figure out what is the truth or what is the reality, purely based off of their personal stance. Okay, and then the final thing that students really have to know is the pragmatics. And this is like how text works. So specifically, when we think about text, they have to know something as, it might seem simple, but something as simple as knowing that we read from left to right and that we read from top to bottom. I recall when I was in middle school, I didn't know how to read the science text because it had all of these like, yes, the columns, and then the pictures with the captions. And I remember having to be told how to do that or how to like navigate the text. So I think that's important to recognize too, that even though it seems simple, when we get into like these more complex texts, it's important to teach students how to navigate that. And then the other thing that they have to know is how to navigate various genres. So in specific genres, there's just different ways to navigate it. You might think about like poetry. Reading a poem is very different from reading a novel or reading, like a scientific explanation or a math problem. Those are all very different, and students have to know how to do that as well. How to navigate those. Okay, so I returned to this slide just to say that when we do teach students the science of reading and go beyond phonics, we can help actually improve student outcomes in reading those challenging texts that are really expected for college and career readiness. And I think that that's really important to be able to do that.